Okay, welcome everyone. It's lovely to see everyone online and in person. So it looks like we've got about 50 people here on this snowy day. So sure as you know, I'm Georgia Mason. I'm director of the Campbell Centre for the Study of Animal Welfare. And let's first acknowledge the land we're on and recognise that where we live is on the traditional, unceded and treaty lands of First Nations, Inuit and Métis people here in Canada. And for those of us in Guelph, we're based on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, one of the Anishinaabe people. And we also reside within Dish with One Spoon territory. And this was an agreement to live in peace between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee people, or the Six Nations. And Claire, I wonder if you could advance your slide. Brilliant. I raised this at the Animal Law Talk, but our closest residential school is in Brantford and was actually is on Six Nations land. It's now called the Woodland Cultural Centre, and about once a month or so, they do a virtual tour given by survivors of the residential school as to what the situation was like there. This is a new kind of professional movie they've made about that horrible situation. And it's on February 19th at 6 p.m. Registration is $10, all to a good cause. I'd thoroughly recommend it, though obviously it's grim. In these weird times, it might start becoming trendy to dismiss caring about Indigenous issues as woke, but I think going to something like this reminds us that truth and reconciliation is really, really important. Okay, so Claire, if we could have your title slide again. I'm absolutely thrilled to have Clare Palmer here. So Claire's going to be talking to us about the knotty issue of wild animal suffering. When should we care? And if we care, when should we act about the vast numbers of wild animals out there? So Dr. Palmer is based at Texas A&M University, where she's the George T. and Gladys H. Abel Professor of Liberal Arts. Get those initials right. She's previously held appointments at the Universities of Greenwich, Stirling and Lancaster in the UK, at Washington University in St. Louis, before settling in Texas. Before that, she worked as a research fellow at the University of Glasgow. And before that, she did a PhD and an undergraduate degree at the University of Oxford. And you might infer from that she's a Brit. She is actually a Brit. Not only that, we're from the same hometown. Not only that, we went to the same high school. We actually knew each other. She was in the year below me. We didn't know each other well. I knew her well enough to go, she's clever. So it's been really lovely kind of converging in recent years. So Claire is a specialist in environmental ethics and more recently in animal ethics. She's co-authored or authored numerous books, including Killing Animals. That sounds like a fun read. My Lab, I think we should all read that next. Companion Animal Ethics with Peter Sando, who some of us know, and Sandra Kaur. And also Wildlife Ethics, which is this new book with Bob Fisher, who was here last year, Jordan Hampton, Christian Gamboard, and again, Peter Sambo. My Lab's reading this right now. We're really enjoying it, although it also drives us crazy. So I'm really excited to hear her talk more about this knotty topic. Thanks, Claire. Over to you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the opportunity to driving everyone crazy today as well. Okay, so thanks very much for inviting me to give this talk. I'm really honoured to talk to such a distinguished audience in animal welfare science. And I'm sorry not to be with you in person. I found myself unable to travel for a patch of time as part of the complex business of becoming a US citizen. And then I wanted to make a joke about, as you Canadians may soon find out, but I decided that not to say that, and now I've said it anyway. Okay, enough. No more Trump jokes in the course of this talk. All right, so I'm going to talk about the ethical challenge of wild animal suffering. And you might wonder, well, why this topic? I think there's a few reasons why this is a topic that's becoming increasingly important and of particular interest, especially to animal welfare scientists. Firstly, that wild animal suffering seems to be becoming of increasing public interest. And I'll give some reasons why we might think that in a minute. And then secondly, which is what I'm going to spend most of the time talking about, there's a fast-growing new ethical movement that's got philanthropic support that's focusing on wildlife suffering. And that links to the third reason here, that I think that some of these developments are likely to impact animal welfare science, and that animal welfare scientists can make important contributions to this debate. And that's actually what I'm going to kind of end by saying. So before I get on to the talk proper, I just wanted to give a couple of terminological clarifications. I'm talking about wild animals. And by wild, and I know wild can be interpreted in lots of different ways. So I'm talking about animals that are free living, so they're not confined, they're not in zoos. And I'm talking about non-domesticated animals, so animals that we haven't bred in particular kinds of ways. So free living, non-domesticated animals. And then when I'm talking about animals, I'm actually thinking about a subclass of animals, the ones that almost everyone agrees are sentient. So that's essentially vertebrates and cephalopod mollusks. And one of the reasons for kind of confining it to this group is that I'm trying to cut off one very complicating angle on this whole discussion, which involves expanding the sphere of the sentient to include, for instance, insects. So some of my philosophical colleagues are very keen on going down that road. We can talk about that later. I think that would really make this discussion even more troublesome. But I'm just going to be basically thinking about vertebrates. That's really what I'm talking about today. So the structure of what I'm going to talk about looks like this. I'll say something about what I take to be the rising concern about wild animal suffering and wild animal welfare. And then I'll explain the consistency challenge from animal ethics. So why there's this group of animal ethicists that are picking up on this challenge, this idea about wild animal suffering and developing it. And then I'll look specifically at two ethical approaches that are quite radical, but that have become very popular in animal ethics, their kind of theoretical position, and then what that means in practice, what they're actually thinking that we should do in the long term. And then I'll look at some alternative ways of thinking about animal ethics, including suggesting at the end a more kind of pluralistic approach than has become common in these views. And then I'll have some very brief tentative conclusions. And one thing I did just want to say is that when I'm discussing what I'm calling the ethical challenge of wild animal suffering, I'm describing the view rather than advocating for the view. So my own views will become a bit more obvious at the end, but I did just want to say I'm kind of explaining why people have this view rather than saying I think this is a great view to have. Okay, so to start with thinking about the rising concern in wild animal welfare. So it's actually difficult, and maybe some of you have more information than I do about this, but it's quite difficult to find concrete statistics about this. But there are a number of kind of indicators, I think, of seeing that there's been a rising concern about wild animals. So one place where I think you find this is especially where there are kind of disasters or large-scale anthropogenic impacts on wild animals. So the top headline on this slide, fleeing mountain lions and scorched earth, can wildlife survive California's wildfires? I think there's been a really quite an increase in concern about big impacts, especially fires, but also other kinds of anthropogenic hazards. And there was certainly a lot of coverage of wildlife in the Australian fires in 2021. And actually, Australia is a place where this seems to be particularly prevalent, being worried about anthropogenic impacts on wild animals. The second place where I think there's evidence for this is in wildlife rescue and the way in which it's rapidly expanded. So the International Wildlife Rehabilitation Council, for instance, now has 16,000 wildlife rehabilitators globally, and it runs courses and provides lay certification in wildlife rehabilitation. Animal Help Now, which is an online wildlife assistance resource in the US, was founded in 2010, so quite recently, but it's really taken off in popularity. So I don't know whether you have in Canada something called Nextdoor. It's a kind of like a Facebook thing for local neighborhoods. And people are always saying, I found this injured animal, and then people recommend, oh, you should, look at Animal Help Now. So that seems to have been picked up very popularly. And just as an example of the kind of commitment that people can have to wildlife rescue, there's an interesting 2019 study in Australia that found that 20,000 volunteer wildlife rescuers were spending 5,300 Australian dollars a year on average caring for rescued wildlife. And they worked with rescued wildlife for around 30 hours a week. So really a pretty long time. So that's a second place I think you find. Oh, and the picture here is from where my parents used to live in Eastbourne in Britain. There's a wildlife rescue shop where they raise money for a wildlife ambulance and wildlife care, and that's one of the people from that shop. Another place where I think you can find some really interesting evidence about the rise in concern about wild animals has come from some research at Colorado State University, where there's a project called America's Wildlife Value. So mostly those studies are based in the United States, but some of them are international as well. And their studies talk about an idea of what they call people's wildlife orientations, and they look at different kinds of wildlife orientations. And the two that are really interesting are the one that they call domination, where people think humans are superior to wildlife and wildlife should be used to benefit people. And then on the other hand, mutualism. So the slide picture on the right here where it says mutualism, I took that from their website. And they have views, mutualists have views like human and wildlife should live side by side without fear, all living things are part of one big family and so on. And they've found that there's been a shift, especially in urban populations, of people moving from domination views to mutualism views, where they think that we should be caring more about wildlife. And then the last sort of piece of evidence, I think, here is that there's an increase in concern about wild animal welfare and wild animal suffering in conservation. And that's especially manifest in what's called the compassionate conservation movement. So I don't know whether many of you here will be familiar with that. There's a Centre for Compassionate Conservation in Sydney that describes its goal as to bring compassion for individuals into conservation decision-making and to shift conservation practices from a species-centric approach to one that values individual lives and their intrinsic worth and rights. Now, I think that's a pretty strong form of compassionate conservation, and there are a number of weaker forms, which, for instance, would say, well, if we need to do a conservation intervention, like we need to get rid of an invasive species, then we should choose a method that's going to cause least suffering. So all of them are really interested in basically individual wild animal welfare. And just in case you think this hasn't penetrated through all realms of society, I thought I would show you this too. So even Lego now has reached out to imbue children with the excitement of thinking about being wildlife rescue off-roaders. Okay, so looking at all of this work and all of these concerns about wild animals, I think it's fair to say that there's some implicit commitments that come out of these kinds of views. So one of them is that we should take wild animal welfare seriously, right? And wild animal suffering is not something to ignore. It's something that we should take seriously. And that when we're thinking about wild animals, we shouldn't just think of them as being members of ecosystems with particular functions or species members, but as being important in themselves. And therefore, that when humans are interacting with wild animals, we should try to reduce the harms that we're imposing on them. So we should try to at least minimize or reduce the suffering we cause wild animals. And then when we're responsible for harming them, that gives us a reason for helping them. And the wildlife rescue and rehabilitation discourse is very much around, you know, humans have caused these harms, so we have some responsibility to take care of animals. So that, I think, is a very common sort of view and quite a widespread kind of view. And that then takes me to what I'm going to call the consistency challenge from animal ethics. So you might kind of see where this is going to go. One of the interesting things about this challenge, as I'll say a bit more in a minute, is that it's coming from really quite a large group of animal ethics and other philosophers who have theoretically disparate views. So they're not all coming from the same perspective, but they all kind of converge on making this kind of challenge. And the basic idea here is, yeah, you know, we're supportive of the idea that that there should be a rising concern for wild animal welfare, but as it's currently manifest in society, it's both piecemeal and it's inconsistent. So most of the worries here have been about anthropogenic suffering. They're about the things that people are doing to animals and causing harms. But these ethicists say if we think wild animals' welfare matters and should be taken seriously, and wild animals matter as individuals, why are we only focusing on harms caused by humans? If animals' suffering matters, why is the cause of responsibility relevant? In the human case, we fight parasites, we fight predators. You know, we wouldn't say, oh, we can't rescue a baby from a tiger because a tiger is natural. And we take the same approach with our animal companions and with agricultural animals. We give them veterinary care, we treat their diseases and so on. So why are wild animals understood so differently? Why don't we extend the same concern to wild animal suffering? These animals are just as sentient, just as vulnerable as the animals that we choose to live with. You know, if we had two wildfires, one that was started by people and one that was started by lightning, and we had wild animals that were suffering and displaced from both of them, why would we think we should only help animals in one context and not the other? Surely we've got reason to be concerned for animals, whether or not the harm that they're suffering is anthropogenic. And so the basic challenge is we should take wild animal suffering seriously, however it's caused, and that gives us a reason to try to relieve that suffering. And that view, which is now extremely popular in philosophy, has major implications. And those implications are even stronger if you think that wild animals have bad lives naturally. And now I'm going to say something about what their view of what wild animal lives is like, and then I'll come back to this consistency challenge. So I call this view the predation paradigm. So that's what I'm now going to be talking about. And this is the most common starting point for this discussion in animal ethics, that most wild animals have miserable lives. They live in the context of evolutionary processes and ecological systems that just don't care about individuals. They have lives that are short, that are fearful, that are constantly threatened, and basically their suffering is overwhelming. And this view, I think, sort of became first public. So some people had talked about it before in philosophy, but it became really popular after this article was published in 2010 in the New York Times. So I've got a screenshot of this article on the right here. So this was an article that was written under the opinionator section of the New York Times by Jeff McMahon. And Jeff McMahon is now the White's Professor of Moral Philosophy in Oxford. So that's like one of the most distinguished positions in the world in moral philosophy. And in this article, McMahon, I don't know if you can read it, but McMahon says, while nature looks kind of sublime and majestic and placid on the surface, underneath, he says, a vast, unceasing slaughter rages. Wherever there is animal life, predators are stalking, chasing, capturing, killing, and devouring their prey. Agonized suffering and violent death are ubiquitous and continuous. And that basic view is what lies behind this current ethical movement relating to wild animal suffering. And this view was developed where people claim that wild animal welfare is not just very bad, but even what's called net negative. So if you have Bob Fisher here, you will know what he's interested in these views about net negative suffering. So that many wild animals' lives have such low welfare that their lives are just not worth living, right? And overall, if you look at wild nature, the bundle of kind of experiences across nature is also net negative because lives are so miserable. And that's partly because of predation, which was what Jeff McMahon was talking about. But there's disease, there's parasites, there's resource limitation, there's privation, and then something that these ethicists are really concerned about, this reproductive strategy of R selection. So R selection, which I'm sure you will know, is when a reproductive strategy that involves large numbers of offspring, most of whom never reach adulthood, and they die when very young, like tadpoles or fish fry, or even the multiple offspring of, say, mice, things like that. And they never get a chance to have any positive experiences, but they like to have horrible experiences, like of being eaten alive and things like that. So our selection is just a sort of natural strategy for bringing about suffering. So that's the backdrop for this view, right? And so then if we come back to this consistency challenge, if you take the predation paradigm as the backdrop, you say, wow, there's huge amounts of wild animal suffering. And if it matters ethically, if we're going to be consistent, we shouldn't just refrain from causing it. We also ought to intervene to prevent it. And this quotation here is from an interesting paper by Dillon and Purvis, who are actually worried about some of the aspects of this argument. But this is how they summarize the view. They say, other things being equal, we ought to prevent or relieve pain. And they think we'll think that in the human case, and we should also think it in the animal case. This is the intuitive starting point for the moral argument in favor of interventions to prevent wild animal suffering. And so they think that actually many people might be drawn in and having this kind of view. And that leads, it's this basic argument, which is fairly simple in itself, that leads these ethicists to argue for interventions to relieve wild animal suffering. And just to give you a taste of how widespread these views are, here are 5 recent books on duties to relieve wild animal suffering that have all been published since 2022. Yep, I think all since 2022. And what's interesting, as I said earlier, about these books is that they have a very different set of kind of ethical, theoretical bases for coming to this view. They converge on similar attitudes to wild animals, but they start from a very different place. So something I thought might be interesting to do now is just to look at 2 different kinds of approaches in a bit more detail to give you an idea of how these arguments actually work out. So one set of views, and 2 of the books there take these versions of this approach, are broadly utilitarian. So any of you who are familiar with ethics will know that, one of the big kind of schools of ethical thinking is utilitarianism, which is basically characterized by bringing about the best consequences in terms of welfare. Now, there are lots of different forms of utilitarianism, but in this discussion, you can have a fairly simple kind of form of utilitarianism. Suffering is bad. If we can minimize or prevent it, we should. And there's a huge amount of wild animal suffering that we could prevent or relieve. So however it's caused. So these utilitarians are essentially argue, look, when we're looking at the wild animal world, we need to try and relieve some of the intense suffering out there. We should go to trying to relieve the most severe suffering that we can actually do something about. And we should try to prevent future suffering. So one of the examples that's talked about, and I was actually at a workshop about this, it wasn't just about animal suffering, but about the screwworm. So the screwworm is this fly that kind of bores into animals and deposits its larvae in there, and they basically eat animals from the inside and kill them. And people are worried about screwworm because of domesticated animals, but also it's prevalent in the wild animal population in parts of South America. And so, that because it's thought to bring such intense suffering, if humans get screwworms, it's incredibly painful. That's the kind of thing I think, well, if we can target things like that, then we should. But one sort of proviso here is to say that these interventions shouldn't be undertaken if you think over time they might create more suffering. So it's got to be the case that it's plausibly true that what you're doing is going to reduce suffering over time. And that's an important kind of clause to bear in mind if you're a utilitarian, because that might constrain some of the things you're going to do. And I'll say more about that later. Okay, so a second approach here is the capabilities approach of Martha Nussbaum. And this is the picture of her from the New York Times, yet again, the New York Times, when she was interviewed after she published her book, Justice for Animals, where she talks about some of these things in an interview in the New York Times. I mean, I think the New York Times is a lot to answer for, but anyway. And when I gave a talk that was a bit like this at the U4 conference last summer, quite a few people had actually read this book. So this seems to have got traction kind of outside of animal ethics because Martha Nussbaum is such a sort of famous public intellectual. And so that she is endorsing this view and that lots of people are encountering it that way, I think is particularly interesting. So Nussbaum is not a utilitarian. She starts from an idea of justice. And she extends the idea of justice from humans out to animals, or sentient animals. And her philosophical approach is kind of based on the idea of that all sentient beings have what she calls kind of capabilities. And every sentient being ought to have an opportunity to fulfill its capabilities up to a certain point. So all animals, all sentient beings should have a chance to live flourishing lives. And so where that's not possible for wild animals, humans should help them to do so in as far as humans can. And I include this quotation from her book because I think it's a particularly interesting quotation, right? She says, the suffering of vulnerable creatures and their premature deaths matter greatly. It is simply not part of the form of life of these creatures to be eaten by predators. Antelopes were not made to be food. They were made to live antelope lives. Now, I think that's a very odd thing to say because antelope form clearly did emerge evolutionarily from being chased by predators. But the basic idea is, that we shouldn't allow predation to happen because it means that animals can't fulfill their capabilities. So again, this is quite a radical view. And she agrees that at the moment we don't have the capacity to be able to promote wild animal flourishing as much as we might like, because we can't be sure how such interventions would turn out. Because it might be that if you, for instance, protected prey from predators, then the predators wouldn't be able to flourish because they might starve. But in principle, enabling flourishing should be the goal of what we do. So I just wanted to then clarify and say, okay, so what do these people actually think that we should do? What is actually the goal here? And in the short term, pretty much all the people who are writing about this say, well, we can only really do relatively small interventions at the moment. We can vaccinate animals against diseases. We can use fertility control to reduce populations, maybe. We can expand wildlife rehabilitation. We can feed animals in cold winters and things like that. But it's very clear that the long-term goal, and here I'm quoting Nussbaum, is what she calls the gradual supplanting of the natural by the just. So when we think about wild nature, ecosystems should be managed not for conservation, not out of respect for nature, but for sentient animal welfare. So this is like a transformational model of how we should think about nature. And a number of people in this field, most of them, I think, advocate in various different ways for the use of biotechnology to re-engineer nature. So in that 2010 piece, Jeff McMahon suggested genetic engineering to change predators into herbivores, if you can imagine. And that idea has been widely taken up in this community. Also, the idea that you might try to make our selected species that are having all these offspring to produce fewer offspring by using things like gene drives and so on. And this has got a name. People call this paradise engineering, trying to create an idyllic biosphere. I mean, I think the issue here is that philosophers, they have to push everything to, what's the logical conclusion of these arguments? Well, if you push this far enough, this is where you're going to end up, right? Trying to create a nature where there isn't suffering or where you minimize suffering. And one of the really interesting features of this argument is that you might think, well, if wild animal suffering is that bad, maybe we'd be just better off not having any wild animals. And this argument has been nicknamed by some of us, including Bob Fisher, the pavers argument, right? And that's after Joni Mitchell's song, where she talks about paving paradise and putting up a parking lot. So, the idea here is, well, wild animal suffering is so bad and all these wild animal lives are not worth living. Perhaps the solution is to pave paradise and eliminate those wild animals. And there are some people who have actually defended this view. There's a guy called Brian Tomasic, who's quite well known for having advocated a view like this. But it's also implicit, I think, in some of the arguments of even mainstream advocates of this view, where they sort of say, well, we shouldn't create ecosystems that are more complicated because that might mean there's more animal suffering. So deserts are better than rainforests and things like that. So I think that that idea is implicit in there. And then just one other thing I wanted to say about one reason for being particularly interested in this view is that these philosophical concerns have been taken up by well-funded philanthropic movements. So I don't know how well-known effective altruism is, but it's essentially a broadly utilitarian movement that has a focus on doing the most good, especially relieving suffering in the most effective ways. So it's about doing good better. And that organization and that idea has a lot of funding that's come out of basically technology. So lots of the tech bros like to fund effective altruism. And that project has always looked for sort of large-scale, tractable and neglected areas, right, where you can relieve suffering. And it's never really been confined to humans. So some of the concerns have been about things like, well, we can tackle malaria with insecticide-infused bed nets, and we can fund developing malaria vaccines, and that's a way of reducing suffering. You know, it's effective and it's relatively cheap. Historically, they've been concerned about in the animal case with industrial farming. But more recently, the argument has been that wild animal suffering is more widespread and more intense than animal suffering in industrial farming. And so we should actually direct money there. And so a lot of money has been coming into organizations such as Rethink Priorities, for which Bob Fisher works, and Wild Animal Initiative, which is another one of these organizations that have been funding research into wild animal welfare, but that's one thing, but with the goal of improving wild animal welfare. So this is a movement that has some significant financial backing, which is one reason to pay attention to what's going on with it. Okay, so now I just want to look at a couple of objections to these views. I'm going to look briefly at some broadly empirical objections, briefly at some alternative approaches to animal ethics, and then say something about traditional conservation kind of responses to this before I come to conclude. So in terms of thinking about some of the empirical objections to this view, there are, I think, different kinds of empirical objections. But one kind of objection is about this idea, this predator paradigm, the idea that wild animal lives are so terribly bad. And this is one place where I think animal welfare science is likely to be really important in future. You know, what really are wild animal lives like? And there are some very recent arguments that wild animal lives are likely to be better than the predation paradigm suggests. So I've got a screenshot of an article by Heather Browning and Walter Veit that was published in Biology and Philosophy last year on positive wild animal welfare. And they argue both that wild animal suffering is less intense, that it's less widespread, and that positive experiences are more common than the predation paradigm accepts. So obviously, you know, there's lots of work needed to think about wild animal welfare. But even if it does turn out that the predation paradigm is wrong, this doesn't really mean that the argument is kind of undermined, because there's still going to be wild animal suffering that needs to be relieved or prevented on this view. But it might shift the urgency. So you might think, well, actually, comparatively, maybe industrial farming, there is more suffering than wild animals. So it could have that effect. A second kind of empirical objection comes from the argument that in practice, we can't improve large-scale welfare, that ecosystems are so complex, we don't have a real way of determining that if we were to intervene in certain kinds of ways, it would actually reduce wild animal suffering. And so Dillon and Purvis, who I quoted earlier, have this argument. They say the nature of ecosystems, because they're so indeterminate, leaves us with no reason to predict that interventions would reduce rather than exacerbate suffering. And they have some examples of things you might do to intervene in ecosystems. Say, yeah, but what about all the knock-on effects? And so, for instance, if you take large predators like wolves out of a system, then let smaller predators start preying, and they might prey on more things and on smaller things. So you don't know what the effects of that intervention are going to be. So that argument tends to militate against large-scale interventions into wild animal suffering, but doesn't say anything about kind of local assistance, pulling a fawn out of a pond and things like that. That wouldn't have these kinds of potentially problematic epistemological concerns. So again, this sort of diffuses, as it were, some of the arguments, but not all of them, were you to think that was right. Okay, so that's some empirical objections. Then some different ways of thinking about animal ethics. So one kind of a very well-known, historically, very common way of thinking about animal ethics would be a very traditional animal rights view, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And on those kinds of views, sentient animals have what are called negative rights. So by negative rights, that's meant rights not to be interfered with in certain kinds of ways. So not to be killed, not to be seriously harmed, not to be locked up. And that view is traditionally been thought of as being quite radical, but it doesn't include a commitment to positive rights, rights to be helped, rights to be provided for. So it doesn't have the implication that wild animals that are suffering should be assisted, or at least not without developing it or adding some positive rights or things like that. So that very traditional view, so anyone who's read Tom Regan, The Case for Animal Rights, that's that kind of view, doesn't have this kind of implication. A second group of approaches, I'm associated with views like this, so that book in the top right-hand corner is a book that I wrote about this, are broadly contextual. And so on contextual approaches, you're likely to get arguments that we have different obligations to animals in different relationships with us and in different contexts. So if we breed animals and they're made dependent on us, we should provide them with food, veterinary care, and so on. But we don't have those kinds of responsibilities to wild animals who are independent from us. And these kinds of arguments essentially mirror the similar arguments that people make in human case. So, I might have a special responsibility to my own child because I brought the child into being, or I chose to adopt the child, and I don't have that same responsibility to feed other people's children as I do to my own, right? So on these kinds of relational views, helping wild animals isn't forbidden, right? So you may do it, but it isn't normally required. And that's what separates this kind of view from those other sorts of views where they say we actually must help wild animals. This view is saying, well, maybe you can, but you don't have to. And then a third set of approaches, and again, there's a wide range of different views here, but that broadly emphasize the autonomy of wild animals in some way. That wild animals might have autonomy rights to manage their own lives or their own communities or their own environments. And your colleagues down the road, Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicker at Queen's, are very well known for defending a view like this in their book Zoopolis, which I've got a picture of here. And on their argument, humans should sort of stay out of the zone of wild animal sovereignty. Their communities are their own, and we shouldn't be interfering with them. And although this hasn't been very well developed, some people are currently trying to think about a view like this. You can see a sort of related view where you might think it's kind of a new colonial project that sort of trying to manage wild animals for their own good. That's happened with people before, and it hasn't really turned out that well. So, why are we trying to extend these kinds of colonizing projects to thinking about animals? So those are some kinds of ways of approaching thinking about animal ethics that don't have these implications. And then finally, in terms of alternative views, you won't be surprised to know that conservation and environmental ethics, traditional environmental ethics, where ecological values like ecosystems, species, and wildness are important, are really very alarmed about the spread of views like this. And so, whereas for the animal ethicists I've been talking about, these ecological values like ecosystem, species, and wildness are not important, or else they're totally subsumed by being concerned about wild animal suffering. But in these views, like in traditional conservation biology, and I have a screenshot of the famous article by Michael Soule in 1985 called What is Conservation Biology? Animal suffering has never been well, people may think that it matters a bit. Conservation is not about protecting the welfare of individuals. So Soule says, although disease and suffering in animals are unpleasant and perhaps regrettable, biologists recognize that conservation is engaged in the protection of the integrity and continuity of natural processes, not the welfare of individuals. And so from this perspective, even were the predation paradigm descriptively correct, so even if the world was terrible for wild animals, we still shouldn't intervene to help, because ecological values are more important than wild animal suffering. And what's more, trying to intervene in wild animals is likely to derail important ecological processes, like predation, and to undermine wildness. So if you think wild environments matter, you certainly don't want to have environments that are being managed for wild animals to reduce wild animal suffering. So there's like a kind of spectrum where you've got the sort of paradise engineers of the wild animal, of the ethics world at one end, and then at the other end, the ecological, those who are concerned about ecology, who would completely reject this idea of paradise engineering. So, I've introduced really quite a wide range of views here. So where on earth can we go with all these different sorts of views? So I thought I would end, just getting to that time, by suggesting a possible way forward, though I don't think it's an easy way forward. So, like most people here, I imagine, I think wild animal welfare does matter, though I also think we need a lot more research into what the lives of wild animals are like. And I also think that we do have different ethical responsibilities to wild and domesticated animals. So despite huge amounts of criticism of my view, I still hold that view. And also that we may have reason to respond differently to anthropogenic and to natural harms. And again, we have that argument in the human case. If I harm you, I owe you something that I don't necessarily owe to someone I haven't harmed. So, these arguments we find in the human case, where philosophers call these backward-looking arguments. They look back to things that have happened, and that helps you to think about, well, what's just and what should happen in the present, rather than really kind of looking forwards only at what the outcomes might be. And I also think that conservation values are important. There are lots of reasons why you might think species matter and biodiversity matters and so on. And there are reasons to protect those too. But that just gives us a whole load of different kinds of factors that we need to take into account. So that means that if you think all of these things matter in some way, you're going to be adopting what people in philosophy call a kind of value pluralist position. You've got diverse values. You're going to have to weigh them when you'll make decisions about whether you're going to help wild animals or not. And that's obviously very complicated, and people are going to disagree about how to weigh these different values. But I don't think there's any getting away from tough decisions like that. And I had a couple of suggestions about, well, how might this sort of work out in practice? So one way of thinking about it is our moral responsibility to help wild animals might increase in cases where the suffering is pretty severe, humans are involved in causing it. We know that an intervention is going to be effective and won't have down the road negative effects. And it also coincides with ecological values. And there are some kinds of interventions like that. And one example would be a wildlife highway crossing. So this is one in Banff. We know that animals use these crossings. We know they cut roadkill and injury, which is caused by humans. And we know they promote ecological values by reducing population fragmentation. So they seem like, kind of win-win. But then there are other cases where helping wild animals is much more morally problematic, where the welfare issue is kind of built into the ecological system, like predation. It's part of what happens in a natural system. So it's not anthropogenic, it's not coming about from human beings, and where it's very difficult to know that an intervention is actually going to reduce suffering overall, which is another problem about something like trying to do anything about predation. And it conflicts with ecological values like wildness and the value of ecological processes and ecosystems and so on. So in that kind of case, intervening in predation is potentially kind of morally problematic. Okay, so my final slide. So this picture is supposed to be the horror of predation, this fiery tiger. I'm not quite sure what I'm doing with him, but anyway. So to conclude, wild animal welfare is increasingly recognized as an important issue. That's true in philosophy. I think it's true in sort of among the general public as well, as I tried to suggest at the beginning. But there are very different ethical views about what we should do about wild animal suffering and wild animal welfare. I suggested this kind of complicated, value pluralist, case-based approach where we think about lots of things as mattering: animal welfare, human involvement, ecological values, they all matter. And although that's going to be very complicated, we just have to accept that we're going to have to carry out social negotiation and things about making resolution in these complicated cases. But the last thing I wanted to say is that animal welfare scientists are obviously in a great position to contribute to those debates. Okay, so thank you very much. And I'm now ready for your questions. And I'm also going to put up the slide so that you know what's coming next week.